Good, good. Today. Okay, good evening, everybody. We will slowly transition from the General Assembly that we just had to this lecture. Thank you very much to those of you who just joined us, and to the other one who are already at the General Assembly. Thank you very much for staying for what will be a very inspiring, I think, presentation for our association that we have just created, that will be given by Peggy Levitt, which I really thanks for taking the time and making a long travel to be with us today. We will talk about decentering, migration and mobility studies. Again, I think a very important topic that we should take into account in the years to come when organizing the activities of that will be part of the association. So Peggy Levitt is the Mildred Lane Kemper Chair of Sociology at Wellesley College and a co-founder of the Global Decenter that also I'm sure we will hear a bit more about in a few minutes. Our latest book includes Move Over Mona Lisa, reimagining what we read, look at and learn, and also transnational social protection, social welfare across national borders. Peggy also co-directed the Transnational Studies Initiative and the Politics and Social Change Workshop at Howard University from 1998 to 2020. So again, I'm very happy and thankful that you are with us today. So Peggy will make a presentation of about 45 minutes, and then we also have the pleasure to have with us Janine Dainden, who will make comments following the presentation. So Janine Dainden is Professor of Transnational Studies here at the University of Neuchâtel, a project leader at the CCR on the Move, and starting February will be a vice rector at the university. So thank you very much, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you today on this special day. I want to congratulate all the people who have been involved in CCR for 12 years. That's amazing, amazing work and an amazing run, I imagine. And congratulations and best wishes to all the people who are going to lead the new organization forward. So I thought I would take my time tonight to try to put some stakes in the ground that I hope might contribute to how you think about how you want to move forward. I think most of the people in this room agree that we live in a world on the move in which some kind of mobility is the rule rather than the exception, and that we're not just talking about movement from one point to another, but a complex, unequal combination of moving bodies, objects, ideas, imaginaries that are all influenced by power, social structures, and technology that go far beyond national containers. So I want to use my time today to talk about 3 ways in which that way of understanding our object of study needs to be better integrated into our field. The first is conceptual, the second is cultural, and the third is ethical or moral. And to make my points, I'm going to draw on some of my recent collaborations. And so I feel like this is going to be a kind of a little bit of a roller coaster ride, going here and then going there and then going there. But I hope that by the end of my talk, you'll see why I hope it adds up to a compelling whole. So the first shift I want to talk about is conceptual, and I'm going to use the example of my work on transnational social protection to make my case. So because most of the world in most of the world, status or some level of permanent settlement and type of integration and national boundedness is still the aspirational norm. We continue to live in a world where social welfare is generally understood to be something that's provided by states to citizens who spend most of their lives at home. The underlying assumption is that access is limited by proximity, so membership in a nation state via citizenship, geographic proximity to the distribution of services within a given territory, and embeddedness in a specific local family or social networks all place natural limits on the availability of social protection. But my co-authors, Ken Sung, Erica Dobbs, and Roxandra Paul, with whom I wrote the book, Transnational Social Protection, Changing Social Welfare in a World on the Move, which was published by Oxford in 2023, believe that this conventional wisdom is sorely out of date. There's an increasing number of long-term residents without membership who live for extended periods in a host country without full rights or representation. There's also more and more long-term members without residence, or people who live outside the countries where they're citizens, but continue to participate in the economic and political lives of their homelands. There are professional class migrants who carry 2 passports and know how to make claims and raise their voices in multiple settings, but there are also many more poor, low-skilled, and undocumented migrants who are marginalized in both their home and host countries. We're also living in a world where states are getting out of the social welfare business. So stepping back from what once were generous provisions or incapable of providing what they promised to begin with. So how do individuals and families protect and provide for themselves when they're born, study, work, and are legal residents of multiple countries over the course of their lives? And what happens when they do so at a time when so many states are getting out of the social welfare business? What we proposed is that a new set of social welfare arrangements has emerged that we call transnational social protection. We find that transnational social protection, or TSP, sometimes complements and sometimes substitutes for traditional modes of social welfare provision. Migrants and their families unevenly or unequally piece together resource environments across borders from multiple sources. So the state, the market, non-governmental organizations or NGOs, and their social networks, and local, subnational. So by that I mean cantons in the Swiss case, or states or provinces, national and supranational actors like regional and international governance bodies are all potential providers of some kind of care. Changing understandings of how and where rights are granted that go beyond national citizenship will aid migrants and non-migrants in their efforts to protect themselves across borders. In fact, what we suggested is 4 logics on which these rights are based. So usually they're based on citizenship, that you're a citizen of a particular country and the Constitution endows you with certain rights. But what we also saw in our work is that people are being endowed with rights by the virtue of being a person or a human, by the virtue of their humanity, by the logic of the market, or by the logic of community. So an expectation that you're going to turn to your family and friends to get the rights get the protections that you need. Now, each of these brings with it a different set of assumptions about what the sources and scope and rationales behind transnational social protection should be. Indeed, as the state steps back, the burden is increasingly on individuals to navigate their way through this complex set of opportunities and constraints, and variations in their ability to do so is a major source of inequality. So what happens when the welfare state in decline meets a world of mobility and migration? We see 3 major ongoing shifts that are the causes and consequences of transnational social protection. The first is that there's a disaggregation of social rights and citizenship. In some places, non-citizens without political rights have access to some rights. So, and this, I'm not sure whether these facts are up to date anymore because so much has changed in the world, but so forgive me and please correct me if you know that I'm wrong so I can update this. But it used to be that in Spain, anyone who could show proof of residency, for example, was eligible for care through the National Health Service after 6 months. Non-citizens are sometimes granted some political rights as well. And we see increasing numbers of countries who allow non-citizen voting in city and provincial elections, for example, especially in Europe. What we also see is the deterritorialization of social protection. So today, there are a wide range of countries of origin and destination who routinely, if grudgingly, not only provide social services to the non-citizens within their borders, but also to their citizens living abroad. These migrant engagement policies go far beyond what we used to think of as consular services, like you go and get help with when your passport is lost. But so now what we're seeing is people like the Vice Minister for Salvadorans abroad reflecting how he characterized his mission as transcending the exclusive provision of the exclusive protection of citizens within a specific territory. So protecting sovereignty also means protecting the human rights of Salvadorans wherever they may be. And I know that Ecuador at one point, and this also might have changed, had that written into its latest constitution. The third major shift that we see is that the nation state is no longer the key purveyor of rights and protections, or the only purveyor of rights. The state is downsizing and supersizing, but it protects citizens and non-citizens alongside other actors. So its role in direct service provision is diminished by refamiliarization. That's a big word that doesn't roll off your tongue, but by that we meant that the responsibility for care is put back on the individual or the family by marketization, or that the expectation is that for-profit entities will provide most of the social services that people need, and by privatization, that there's a shift away from the public sector. The rise of neoliberal economic policies based on self-reliance and minimal intervention into the market transform the market into an ever more important source of social welfare. So when we only focus on the nation state, we also miss the many ways in which the national policy is supplemented, complemented, and sometimes subverted by subnational arrangements and by international law and supranational organizations as well. So when national governance fail to guarantee basic rights to migrants living within their borders, sometimes provisional or state governments step in. Governments also enter into bilateral and multilateral agreements backed by organizations like the UN or the ILO. International policy instruments like the UN Migrant Workers Convention or the ILO Migrant Employment Convention also provide frameworks under international law for such types of cooperation. So at least in theory, if a state fails to provide or protect, an individual can appeal to any one of a number of international institutions or conventions. But in reality, I know you all know that in many cases, their power is often much more symbolic than real. And there aren't a lot of sticks with which to make countries comply with what they promise to do as signatories. Excuse me. Okay, so my colleagues and I really want to be crystal clear. Transnational social protection is not a panacea. It creates new and reshuffles old inequalities. The nation state doesn't disappear, but it's repurposed, shedding old functions and assuming new ones. Therefore, what we argue is that state-driven, territorially limited, and nationally bounded systems of social protection are giving way to, or at a minimum, operating in tandem with traditional modes of social protection. Rather than treating the national and the supranational as strongly connected but still separate and discrete, we see individual migrants and non-migrants and the national, regional, and supranational institutions and policies that affect them as embedded in the same transnational social field. They protect themselves and their families using resources derived from the multiple sites and sources within that field. While the state is still a crucial actor, it by no means acts alone in providing social protection. Beyond countries of origin and destination, we include the market, NGOs, and communities as sources of support. Individuals use these in both countries of origin and destination and create resource environments that heighten vulnerability for some and liberate and empower others. And in fact, a key research question I would suggest to all of you moving forward is, who are the winners and losers in particular contexts, and how do we need to adjust how we respond based on those different sets of configurations? But there's still the central question, which is, how do individuals and families actually get access to social protection in the context of mobility and migration? And what we argue is they do so by creating these resource environments, which include services provided by the state, services purchased from the market, services for nonprofit organizations like churches or labor unions and NGOs, and support available from family and friends and other social network members. The resource environment is what is actually available to an individual in their toolkit, as opposed to what's theoretically available or legally available to them. So the cluster of protections an individual or a family can assemble depends upon the nature of the market, the strength and capacity of countries of origin and destination. So how rich are they? How well organized are they? The third sector organizational ecology. So are we talking about a place where migrants have been coming for a really long time? So there's a whole bunch of NGOs that support migrant rights and provide services to migrants, or is it a very underdeveloped sector? And the characteristics of individual migrants, families, and communities themselves, which would include things like migrants' country of origin, place of residence, the breadth and depth of individual social networks, in addition to things like race, gender, ethnicity, religion, class, and education. In some cases, all four sources are available in the countries of origin and destination, but in others, they're not. Resource environments also change dramatically over time. So by leaving some groups well protected and others increasingly vulnerable, different kinds of alliances and struggles continuously transform what's on offer. So for instance, in the US, when we were fighting for universal healthcare coverage under the Obama administration, a lot of cross-class coalitions came together that at least temporarily made conditions more favorable for all migrants, whether they're documented or undocumented. So let me try to give you 3 examples to try to make this more concrete. So this is the resource environment of a college-educated, employed female citizen in Sweden. So the state arrow is really thick because she gets so much protection, such generous protections from the state. She has enough money to buy things from the market, but she doesn't really need them. The third sector is also really small because she can take care of most of her needs by herself, and she has a lot of individual ties that she could turn to if she needed to, but she doesn't have to. This is someone with a similar profile in the United States. And here the state and the market are reversed. So the state is not very generous. The market is generous, but you have to have the money to purchase what you need. And then again, this woman does not need, she doesn't have to turn to a food kitchen or help from her church to find a place to live. And she has plenty of friends who can help her if she needs to. And then this is the resource environment of a woman from rural Mexico who's working in Los Angeles. So this is a transnationally created resource environment with resources from Mexico and resources from the United States. So let's take a look at the US side first. the state, she's not eligible as someone undocumented. She's not eligible for anything from the federal government, at least for 5 years. And who knows how that will change or how it's changed. So many things are in flux right now. But in the state of California, where she lives, she is eligible for certain emergency health care through the California state Medicaid system. So that's why the line is dotted. She can't afford anything from the market, to purchase anything from the market. She depends heavily on help from her church and her her community, the immigrant community, and she has a lot of ties among fellow immigrants that she can also turn to for help. On the Mexican side, if she goes back to Mexico, she's eligible for, well, she'll always be eligible for Mexican Social Security, what she's paid in, but she's also eligible to get service from the Mexican National Healthcare System. And she did purchase something from the market, which is a house where her children are living with her mother, and that is kind of her retirement nest egg, where she will go back to live. And in that village, there are lots of people with, there are lots of international organizations that help at the school and help in the health clinic. And she also has lots of family ties and social ties that are helping. So let's talk about how this would change though. So she's living in Los Angeles and she's from, let's say, Zacatecas. And so she's not from an indigenous community. But let's say she was from Oaxaca, so from an indigenous community that has its own governance structure and sort of system of citizenship where you have to do certain tasks in the community even when you're a migrant, and then you get certain things back from the community. So that's a source of social protection that someone in a different indigenous area of Mexico might be able to access. And if she lives in New York, there are going to be different services and based on what New York State provides and based on what New York City provides, okay? So this is all very, very place dependent. And what happens if she moves to a place like Wyoming, which is a relatively new destination for immigrants? So many fewer services for immigrants, much less developed immigrant rights organizations, and also in times of really high xenophobia, like what we're going through now, you don't even want to go out of your house to be seen, especially if you'll be identified by your racial characteristics. So all this to say that resource environments change over time, and also they really change place by place, and that is a big influence on how plentiful they are or how precarious they are. So the cluster of protections a family and an individual or a family can assemble depends upon, okay, let me just see where I am. Yes, okay. So 3 things stand out about this experience, though. The first is that none of her needs are met by one source that's bounded in the United States, for example. So she's dependent upon a large number of disparate, informal, and transnational sources that are not contractual, that can disappear in a moment. Second, no one possible source covers all of her needs, and that is indicated by the relative thinness of some of the arrows. And these things are not contractually guaranteed, so they're unreliable and often disappear. So, okay. So for people who each of the sources of support can be withdrawn at any time and without recourse for the migrant. So, okay. So what are the implications of some of this? Well, the first is that we're not talking about a world of welfare without borders. What we're arguing is that inequality is reshuffled and not eliminated, and that enhanced protections for some people give rise to greater vulnerability for others. So this whole scenario that we're witnessing and documenting really raises tough questions about distributive justice. And I think it also raises questions about how the policies and institutions that we have in place are out of sync with the kind of world that we live in. So any kind of nationally bounded, static institution of care that expects people to stay in one place their whole life is going to really leave a lot of people out. And I think we don't have the policy making tools and the policy making imagination to really address that. Now, we feel that states have to be held accountable for the welfare of their citizens, both resident and non-resident, and that every human being should get the protections that they need. And, you know, how can states turn their backs on the people that help make their societies function? But when I'm going to be really honest with you here that it's not easy to get people to think outside the nation state box about policymaking. Many of the people that we've spoken with since writing this book they can think bilaterally or trilaterally, but they can't really think beyond that, especially thinking regionally. And, you know, when I tried this out with a high-level policymaker in the United States, and this was before the Trump administration, she said there was just no constituency for this because what senator or what congressman is going to expend their cultural capital and their social capital on a project like this? And even with the European Union, which from the outside looks like the most natural constituency for something like this, when we tried to pitch an executive training course in transnational social protection to policymakers through the European Commission, they weren't interested because they just couldn't kind of understand it. So we have a long way to go on this to kind of get the institutions and policies in place that are more resonant with how people live. So that's the first part of my talk. My second set of comments concern bringing culture back into what we do and paying more attention to the relationship between migrating people and migrating culture. Now, when I speak about culture, I'm not just talking about ideas and objects that circulate, but about a broader understanding and deeper integration of culture in all of its forms into our analysis. Basically, what I'm saying is that migration is a cultural act. And so we need to understand those cultural dynamics that either enable migration or enable mobility or else thwart it. So let me say a little bit more of what I mean by that. We all receive an enormous amount of information in our daily lives. And to make sense of it, we use shared schema and scripts and kind of mental shortcuts that help us organize and process incoming information and perceptions in light of previously stored knowledge structures and processes about given objects or concepts or events and evaluations. So the sociologist Isabella Gijón calls culture a landscape of meaning. And by that she means a kind of background or wallpaper that you don't even notice, but it's what makes social life possible. Since the places where culture is enacted have different histories and demographies and social structures, people rely on different sets of meanings. And some templates and frames become more important than others. They give rise to and legitimate new forms of identities and values, which strongly shape the possibilities for movement, incorporation, and social mobility. So for a long time, I've been interested in the relationship between the migration of people and the migration of culture. And in fact, in my forthcoming book, Move Over Mona Lisa, Reimagining What We Read, Look At, and Learn, that I'm studying why the circulation of ideas and culture produced outside the West is still so limited compared to what flows from the West to other parts of the world. This is important to our field because it's still so Western centric. The categories that we use, how we do research, and our expectations about mobility and livelihoods are just some examples. That's why even in this moment of heightened nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment, and backlash against programs to make museums, libraries, and universities more inclusive, we still hear calls around the world to globalize, decolonize, diversify, and I would say decenter. Leaders argue that a broader range of content created by a broader range of people from all parts of the world needs to make it into the world's cultural and intellectual institutions. I'm not saying to displace the Mona Lisa altogether, but to make room for underrepresented voices. So why, if so many people are calling for dramatic changes, has change been so slow? Why does power still remain in the hands of a concentrated few? And why do culture and ideas created in the West still control the conversation? So my answer, based on research among artists and writers and thinkers in South Korea, Argentina, and Lebanon, is the inequality pipeline. This is a pipeline that has multiple nodes. So think of them as like a supply chain of exclusions that begin when aspiring artists or writers and thinkers don't have the tools or the materials to even get started. So somebody who's never had art supply, a child who's never had art supplies versus the child in Europe or North America who's surrounded by all kinds of materials. And then it continues when the author writing in a European language gets translated frequently, and then their work circulates widely, and somebody who's writing in Arabic or Hindi is only read by people back home. The pipeline then passes through the annual circuit of biennials, art fairs, auctions, book fairs, literary festivals, and it extends not just to where culture is produced, but also and exhibited and sold, but also to where it's researched, published about, and discussed in universities and academic conferences. So what happens at one end of the pipeline where we produce culture and ideas, and when the emerging artist or writer can't get their start, is intricately connected to the other end of what we research and publish about and what we teach, and what ends up getting into classrooms and journals and public lecture halls. So I want to be clear. The unequal distribution of economic and political power is largely responsible for this inequality that I found in the academic and cultural worlds. So just like there's a world system of academic dependency in which industrialized countries rely on cheap labor and raw materials from poor countries to attain and sustain their comfortable lifestyles, there's a world system of cultural and intellectual dependency. And in this scenario, North American and European scholars extract materials or data from the global South and build successful careers from the finished products, so books and articles that they produce, often without giving sufficient credit to the local scholars that they've worked with along the way. But what I want to say is don't despair. The good news is that my field work in South Korea and Argentina and Lebanon revealed that some people in the global academic and cultural worlds are fighting back. There's a decentered cultural and intellectual globalization aimed at challenging and reordering long-standing inequalities that's already underway. It's just that many of us haven't been looking and listening. So when we think about strategies to address cultural and intellectual inequality, it's normally focusing on diversity. So the answer is to bring a more diverse group of creators and creations in. So the traditional centers of Western power, like London or Paris or Neuchâtel or New York, I just want to see if you're listening, can stay in place. They just have to have more different kinds of people and more different kinds of work. And that's definitely important steps forward. But, and a large number of the people I talked to while writing this book would be delighted to see the work that they make or the work that they represent end up in Europe and North America. So when I asked modern and contemporary art museum professionals which museum do they most want to emulate? What do you think that they said? I'm giving it away with this picture. They said the Museum of Modern Art or the Tate Modern. And when I asked them which universities they most want to be like, what do you think they said? They didn't say Wellesley College. They didn't say this illustrious university. They said Harvard University. So these folks are interested in soft reform. And for me, that is where you transform the existing centers of power by making them more diverse, and you scale shift. So, you know, people want to move up in the global cultural hierarchy and open it up just enough so that they can come in and then recenter it, and with them in a more you know, privileged position. So fighting back against the neoliberalization of the global cultural and intellectual worlds, or fundamentally reordering them, is not on their agenda. But what I also found is there's another type of decentered cultural globalization going on that disrupts the pipeline in a more fundamental ways. And it builds on movements that were very powerful, but sometimes we forget about, like the non-aligned or the third world or the negritude movement, that brought together leaders in newly independent or aspirationally independent and who were trying to chart a, you know, their own autonomous cultural, economic, and political path forward. And so I see this as an extension of that. So decentered cultural globalization takes two forms. The first happens when new nodes of power, I think I didn't, yes, here we go. New nodes of power, new institutions, and alternative networks of circulation emerge that connect like-minded actors throughout the global north, south and north. In essence, it's like a parallel cultural landscape with coexists with, competes, and sometimes displaces long-standing cultural capitals. So as Lebanese-born independent curator Maisa Abu Rahal put it, people are inventing new ways of thinking about museums, new interactive programs, new podcasts, new publishing houses in their own way, according to their own metrics of success. That doesn't mean that people don't want to go to North America or Europe anymore. We'll always go to MoMA, the Tate Modern, the Centre Pompidou, but we'll also go to Saudi Arabia, Buenos Aires, and Kochi. In fact, for many, circumventing traditional power brokers and circulating internationally without having to depend upon the global north is the whole point. Argentine independent publisher Leonora Diamant put it this way: "We want," she said, "to have books travel from Argentina to Mexico City without having to pass through Madrid." I think that really encapsulates the vision. She and others like her want a cultural and intellectual landscape with multiple centers in which participants from the global south are treated as equals. These are not emerging scenes, Abu Rahal stated emphatically. They have been there for a while, but most of the world is not interested. A second kind of global cultural decentering happens when actors and institutions opt out of the global project. So the anthropologist Audra Simpson talked about refusal. She used the word refusal to describe indigenous communities who lived in the northern part of the United States and Canada, who refused to accept Canadian or US citizenship because they saw themselves as living in their own sovereign territory with their own, you know, their own rule of law that they wanted to participate in. Artists and writers and academics that study them refuse for several reasons. One is that they live in countries like Mexico or India or China that are large enough and wealthy enough to have thriving intellectual and cultural scenes of their own. So they don't depend upon integration into the world system to have healthy intellectual and cultural lives. Another is that they were never well integrated into the dominant world system to begin with. So a colleague from Indonesia told me that her students learn much more about their own knowledge production from Indonesia because they most universities can't afford access to like JSTOR or, Western databases. And so they're much more focused on their own intellectual production. And others who live in countries where decoloniality is not a household word say, what is the fuss all about? So either way, when you turn your back on cultural globalization, you're kind of popping its balloon and sucking the air out of it, which for me is a kind of decentering of itself. So some of these individuals who are involved in decentering cultural globalization seek fundamental change, but ones that leave the institutional hierarchies intact. So let's call that hard reform. Imagine, for example, universities organized around social problems and their solutions rather than departments or majors, or libraries organized around geographic regions, non-Western cosmologies, or historical periods rather than the US Library of Congress categories, which is the most predominant categorical system that is used all over the world and is grew out of Thomas Jefferson in the late 1700s. So those are the basic categories that form that system that are still in use. But other people I met are seeking much more foundational change. They see some institutions as beyond repair because they're born flawed with racism and colonialism in their DNA. They call for a total starting from scratch, or what the gesturing towards a decolonial future calls hospicing. What by that they mean you help institutions die a slow death and then start over. You clear the ground and you start over. Now, this starting over can change the cultural and intellectual ways in unexpected and not yet imagined manner, an unlearning that gives rise to new sites of teaching and mastery outside of traditional classrooms, or what we call, this is for you, Janine, when you're the new vice rector. Here's some advice about what you should think about. I didn't write this before I knew you had your new job, but but just imagine it. What would an ununiversity look like? What could new spaces of learning, new spaces of displaying, and new spaces of classifying and organizing knowledge look like that we haven't imagined, but could be organized around non-Western epistemologies and ontologies. They could nurture physical, emotional, and spiritual skills as well as intellectual ones, or foster a culture of collective research, analysis, and writing in contrast to our current individualistic one. These might be organized as the world is witnessing now, and this is buyer beware, according to authoritarian white supremacist values designed to put even more power in the hands of a very few. So I want to be very crystal clear that that's not the kind of beyond reforms that I'm looking for. So I want to offer you a concrete example that brings the relationship between migrating people and migrating culture in its many forms to, and how culture strengthens our analysis. And it has to do with the idea of vernacularization. Now, vernacularization is a word that Sally, Mary, and I started to use in our work together. And what we used vernacularization rather than translation or communication because we see vernacularization as going beyond those two things to make something not only understandable and comprehensible, but usable and appropriate and applicable to a certain to a certain context. So vernacularizers frame and explain so that consumers can consume what artists and writers produce. So in my story, lots of people are vernacularizers, artists and writers themselves, curators, gallerists, publishers, collectors, and cultural entrepreneurs. So take the example of Lebanese artist Akram Zaatari, who is part of what became known as the post-war generation of Lebanese contemporary artists. Each artist translates a world that is so small to a world that's so big, Zaatari told me. You do that transition in each work. He's from a Muslim community, and although an atheist, he's proud of where he comes from and feels a certain obligation to explain it to others. One of his pieces about a man praying alongside his son. If viewers don't know the daily prayers, they'll not notice that the father is adding gestures to entertain his son, so he too will learn to love the traditions and revere them. So I need to explain this to international audiences so they can appreciate the work. I'm a bridge. He's a vernacularizer. I don't want to prescribe the experiences of viewers, but hope to walk a line between helping them entering without determining what happens once they do. You have to leave room for leaks. Now, two types of vernacularizers are particularly important, and they're created by migration. So they both aid circulation, but in distinct ways because they bring experiences, different kinds of experiences and skills to the task. So the first kind are diasporic vernacularizers. So these are people who are transnational. They live transnational lives. They work outside their home countries, but they still do work connected with them. And their comparative advantage, as you all know, is that they can function in both of those contexts and build that bridge or vernacularize between those contexts, which is really important for the pipeline. Because if somebody doesn't understand, resonate with a particular work of art, or somebody doesn't resonate with the aesthetics, the work is not likely to go very far. So it's really important that that kind of shared understanding allows people to communicate and bridge those gaps. And a shared ethnicity or nationality or generational identity is fertile soil from which that understanding grows. Peggy, who's a Korean artist who's one of the most famous international artists from Korea at this moment, she makes no bones about how she got opportunities from her fellow Koreans. It wasn't just that they were in a position to do so, she said. It was also that when someone sees his or her creative lineage as connected to the same set of artistic ancestors, they're better able to untangle the black box of what it means to be a South Korean artist. Bina Choi has been her co-conspirator from the outset. They were both trying to break into Western-centric colonial art worlds with their heads held high. Dorian Chung, who's the artistic and chief curator at the M+ Museum in Hong Kong, is also a fellow traveler. He still holds a passport, and because he is perfectly bilingual, he can engage with the materials she references in her work, which a lot of it hasn't been translated. So a lot of Korean Americans who she also encounters don't have that same level of simpatico. They don't understand each other so well because they're using different kinds of theoretical conversations in their work. Now, the second group is a transnational professional class who's also always on the move. So you know these people. They are the people who teach at universities maybe around the world. So they might teach in the Gulf or in Asia, going from one university to another, or maybe they work at a museum in the United States, and then they go to Asia, and then they go to Europe. And each time they do, they're carrying new things that they've vernacularized into their toolkit and applying them to new settings. And for me, those people are responsible for like the homogenization of the cultural sector, because, for example, take the idea of what we call world-class museums. World-class museums, you walk into them, and so many of them are similar in the sense that they have the same kind of ways of exhibiting, ways of educating, similar public programming. They also have gourmet restaurants and bookstores and gift shops with their Frida Kahlo magnets. And so this is another group, a class of migrants that are homogenizing what we do in classrooms and what we do in cultural institutions. And so what are the key takeaways from this and my plea for bringing culture as it's more expansively defined into our work, that it is the wallpaper against which things like identity, belonging, justice, equality, and socioeconomic mobility are defined and redefined, and that shape what's possible. So in essence, as I said before, mobility itself is a cultural act. That the migration of people and how culture and ideas circulate are inextricably linked, and that a freer flow of one is necessary for the freer flow of the other. This is key to questions like if and when a migrant author can become a national author, or how and what is included in the national literary or artistic canon, and if it expands or not. And that we also see in countries like Korea, much like the Philippines, that purposely exports laborers, and Korea is using migrants to upscale in the global cultural hierarchy. So just as some countries who depend upon remittances from low-skilled migrants or political lobbying capacity of middle-class migrants, countries can also depend upon and recruit or seduce professional high-class migrants to further their cultural cause. Okay, so now I'm on the last part of my talk, which is about the global decenter and decentering. And this is about the values and ethos that guide our work. I believe that our field and the academic and cultural worlds in general need major makeovers in order to move us away from the model of a single, lone, usually male genius whose ego and brilliance and power allow him to theoretically triumph, to one of researching, analyzing, writing with generosity and humility and collaboration, especially in ways that bring newer, younger, and underrepresented participants in. Now, you might be wondering why I use the word decenter and what I mean by it, and when so many other conversations about the similar things are use different vocabulary. The answer is that I spent the last 10 years helping to build an international network called the Global Decenter. And as a result, my ideas and how I do research and how I write and how I share what I've write is very, very influenced by that experience. And so I want to give full credit to all my colleagues at the GDC, with whom I've developed a lot of what I'm sharing with you today. The GDC is an international network of, and this is somewhat aspirational, but somewhat true. So we hope to be truly interdisciplinary, so academics of all kinds, although right now we're more humanists and social sciences. We want to include culture managers, and we have people who are curators, who are museum professionals, who are translators, culture makers, so artists and writers, and people who use culture in their activism, who are committed to producing, disseminating, teaching about, and acting upon knowledge in more inclusive ways. Now, of course, we are by no means the first to take up these issues, and we build on the backs of many people who came before us, but we try to be truly international. So by that, I mean not just having members from Europe and North America, or having people from Global South who live in Europe and North America, but really trying to go out to countries that are not well integrated into our usual conversation, and not to go to the capital city, but to go to the university and the province to find them. To also be truly interdisciplinary, to embrace what we talk of as a Southern attitude. That's a professional and ethical stance that trades in the ego and competition and hubris that often dominate the museum or university, in exchange for a stance of humility and generosity and collaboration and care. And also to not stop at critique. So I think we're all really good at, we get an A at criticizing, and we get a needs improvement in charting a positive way forward. So we're really trying to move past that. Critique is enough. So truly decentering needs to go far beyond decentering just ideas and content as the soft reformers I was talking about, this idea that diversifying is enough. And so in addition to decentering, in addition to opening up the ideas and materials that we use, we also need to decenter ourselves as individuals, the institutions where we work, and the infrastructures that connect them. So I'll just say a little bit about each in turn, and then I will be concluding. So I think the first step to dismantling the inequality pipeline is to decenter ourselves. And it's almost like an intellectual practice. So just as an ethical practice. So just like meditators, I don't know how many in the room meditate, but you always have to return to the breath, return to the breath. This is that you return to your default, you check in with yourself about how your default categories are shaping up, how you show up in the research partnership, in the writing collaboration, when you're sitting around the conference room table. So I know that if I'm at a table where I've been working with the same people for many years, I'm not usually listening with open ears and an open heart because I say, oh, I know what that person's going to say. They're going to be the one who talks about this, or they're going to be the one who complains about this. So decentering ourselves means that we say, you know, how do my default categories, the fact that I speak English, that I come from the United States, that I'm a sociologist, color how I listen, how I receive, how I respond, and can I make sure that I'm listening openly, continuously with beginner's mind so that everyone at the table feels welcome and respected and valued, and that we're all teachers and learners. So we have to, this is not easy, right? We have to keep on always unlearning and failing and trying again and eventually getting better at waking up when we're asleep at the metaphorical wheel. Okay. The second thing, the second part of decentering is to decenter our ideas. And I've already said a lot about that. But I think we need to go beyond that diversification work to understand how those people that are always the ones who are trotted out got there to begin with. And you all know that that's about social networks, and that many folks who end up coming to the globe from the global south to the global north and studying, that's network driven. They study with the same people, they learn the same, master the same literature. And so there's a diversification, but it's really, really insular. And we need to really, and then we're complacent because we say, okay, we need a Latin American, we need an African, we need someone from the Middle East, Ibn Khaldun, yep, checked, now we're done. So decentering ideas goes beyond that to really think about how those networks are now reifying and solidifying the pipeline rather than disrupting it. And then we talk about disrupting institutions, which of course is hard because institutions do not like to change by their very nature. So I think that's about not just diversifying the curricula or exhibiting broader set of works, but to really ask fundamental questions about what education is for, and which is a very different question than what an educated person needs to know. That requires clearly defining what the institution believes the rights and responsibilities of global citizenship are, rather than hiding behind that term's uncanny ability to sort of capture everything and really stand for nothing. And I think there's also a fundamental tension between educating students for their own social mobility or reproducing their already upper class status and teaching them to care about and take responsibility for larger communities. And that's something that needs to be talked about, not just in the philosophy classroom, but all over the place. So once that happens, you can imagine a domino effect of all kinds of changes. Mastery that's not confined to facts and figures, but rather could be measured in terms of creativity and leadership and emotional and spiritual competences. Should evaluation always be externally driven, or can students evaluate themselves? Do we always honor the alumni who makes the most money in the most corporate setting, or can we also honor people who are doing really important things in a quiet way that's underseen? And finally, decentering infrastructures is to create South-South and South-North networks with like-minded partners that can circumvent the traditional centers of power. So when I say the South, or when we say a Southern attitude, we're not talking about a geography. We're talking about a political commitment and a professional ethos of generosity and humility and collaboration. So we need, however, to proceed with great care, because we see examples of former peripheries that are now becoming centers. So when you see cities like Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Doha, they have a lot of intellectual and cultural, well, a lot of cultural power now, but they really reproduce many of the same hierarchies and inequalities that we've always seen, and with fewer political freedoms. So there's no guarantee that when new epistemologies and ontologies gain traction, that they're going to be used in a more equitable manner. So as Angela Davis argued, diversity without an underlying commitment to justice can just be another way to subjugate and oppress. So I want to, in the spirit of always charting a positive way forward, I think I skipped a slide, I'm going to leave you with this. This is a picture from an exhibition at the Tate Modern Turbine Hall, which, if any of you have been there, it's the gigantic old factory building that's, you know, like the size of an American football field. And Tania Bruguera is a Cuban artist and activist based in the United States, who, among many other honors, received the Hyundai Commission to create something in this Turbine Hall in 2019. She wanted to make something with the community, to transform audiences into active citizens. She worked with Tate Neighbors, which is a group of artists and activists and residents of all ages who live near the museum in what's now London's largest Latin American community. When Tania asked Natalie Bell, who's a longtime activist and community member, for an example of something that she had done that she was especially proud of, she brought up the case of a young man named Youssef, who was a 17-year-old Syrian refugee who came to Great Britain with nothing, but went on to create his own organization for youth in Brighton. Bruguera created a portrait of Youssef the size of a good portion of this enormous floor, and then covered it with thermochromic ink. For audiences to see what was there, they had to lie down together and uncover his portrait with their body heat. Now, this is a project that works on so many levels: the people it honors, the community process through which it was created, and the fact that neighbors and strangers have to lie next to one another to literally bring it to light. It's a mini revolution in the midst of a contemporary art world giant, which, although impermanent, sets a precedent and moves things over so that people can come in who haven't felt welcome before. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this really thoughtful and inspiring presentation. And now I will invite Jalene to give some, or this one, you can also.
Oh, no.
This is for the people who are online.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thanks first to the SAMS for giving me the opportunity to briefly comment on Peggy's talk. You know, the German speakers among you who have kids, do you know the SAMS, the book you tell the kids? Couldn't you have chosen another name for your association? I have non-stop these ideas. It's quite nice children's books, actually, but nevertheless, okay. But then, so many thanks for inviting me to comment Peggy's talk. And Peggy, many thanks, of course, for your inspiring presentation. I really always really love listening to you and also reading your work. And I think it's consistently stimulating, in particular because you not only criticize, but you try to develop some visions how we could move further, even though I think they're often a bit overwhelming. But I might be coming back to this a bit later. So I really thought it's very difficult to comment these elements you brought up, because it's not only convincing your ideas, but also very carefully elaborated. You present some research and transformation programs, but I will try to do it. And so in your talk, you kind of outlined 3 ways in which mobilities and migration studies can be approached, or alternatively key challenges that require further reflection and research. And then you kind of elaborated on 3 shifts: conceptual, cultural, and the ethical one, that you see emerging and that need to be addressed. And I think it's extremely kind of you to give this talk when this association is kind of funded. So you have now a big research program. Good luck with doing it. I think it's quite challenging. So my comments are not, it's more comments and not questions, and maybe a bit more compliments to your arguments. I'm not sure that this works, but I still offer them. And I would like, the first one comment is a bit longer and 2 are quite short. So the first one is that you addressed how mobilities and migration challenge national welfare systems, and you convincingly argued that the national container model of welfare is increasingly outdated. Social protection remains largely confined to the national framework and is still primarily provided by states to citizens. And at the same time, welfare systems are in decline, they opt out, and the world is becoming more mobile and more interconnected, and this, of course, creates fundamental mismatches and asks for new political solutions. And you then introduce this concept of this transnational social protection, and also the idea of resource environments, that migrants go back to different environments across borders, and they draw on multiple sources like states, churches, NGOs, and so on. And you also formulate some takeaways, which I think are of crucial political importance. So we need new policies and institutions that can respond to this world on the move, where people live outside the countries of citizenship while needing social protection. And that we need to think about distributive justice much more in-depthly and so on. And I think what I found really compelling, and this I think is very much talking to the way I try to do research, is that your examples came from migrants and non-migrants, residents and non-residents. So basically you do a kind of demigrantized research design without saying it like this. But I really think that this is a way, and your example shows it very nicely, how we need to do migration studies to go beyond studying migrants, basically. And this does, of course, not mean to ignore migration regimes, migrantization, and migrants themselves. That's definitely not what you're doing. But I think we can complexify certain things if we take this general view on this issue on social protection, not just what is social protection for migrantized people, but for everyone. And I think what your work does is also this often taken for granted opposition between migrants and citizens to put into question, kind of. No? So Bridget Anderson, she argued that there are important connections between the formal exclusion of non-citizens and the multiple of informal exclusion within citizenship. And in a debate with Bridget, I suggested to think in terms of a kind of a migrant-citizen nexus, because this can allow us to see us how citizens can be migrantized, but also how migrants can be citizenized. I mean, I know we're not a terrible, terrible world. I'm really excusing myself, really, all my apologies. But still, I think this is quite interesting, because then we can really think about what are the pattern of social protection that do emerge when we do not follow this migrant-citizen divide, and what can we learn from this pattern. And I think your research shows us exactly that we can learn a lot if we have this kind of approach. Like when you discuss your first shift, this disaggregation of social rights and citizenship, you point in this direction, no? The distinction between citizens and non-citizens becomes much more complex when non-citizens gain access to certain rights, such as healthcare, like undocumented migrants can have healthcare on the basis of Human Rights Convention. They kind of getting citizenized, these migrants, so to speak. Or the political rights, the other example you bring, they offer all of a sudden, offer another example how citizenship and social rights become disaggregated. And the canton of Neuchâtel is actually a very good example. Male foreigners actually had the right to vote in Neuchâtel before the Swiss woman. Just to say, now everyone can vote, but still, this is also a kind of disentanglement. And also, you talked about territorialization of social protection. And I think there's this very, very great thesis of Catherine Taleras. I don't know if you know it. I was honored to be member of the panel, you know, in Oslo, where you have to be opponent. You always have to opponent. But actually, she shows how Norwegian welfare systems, how they adapt to people leading transnational lives. It's very interesting because from the perspective of the Norwegian state and bureaucrats, these individuals, they are not migrants but citizens, but the transnational practices really challenge this territorially bounded welfare logic, and it changed the welfare logic. So I think this kind of research, again, it's not on migrants, this research. And this kind of research, I think, can really push us further to understand what's going on in this field of social protection under condition of nation-state structures, basically. So under what condition do non-migranticized as much as migranticized people rely on such resource environment, state-based and non-state-based, for social protection? What is similar and what is different? And where is migranticization crucial? And where do poverty and precarity maybe outweigh citizenship status? I think these are, it seems to me, quite important questions we have to ask when we address these big issues. And it's not enough to work on migrants, as your research so nicely shows. So this, I think, is also maybe a lesson for the sums, again, to go back to it. My second and third points will be more short. So first, concerning your cultural argument and these ideas of this inequality pipeline, well, I found this part of your talk unexpectedly hopeful, I must say. And I think it's quite important in this moment where we all need a bit of hope. So you really show that while these deep inequalities are produced by this unequal distribution of economic and political power, you also show that these structures are being challenged. And I think that's where we do need to do research, showing what are the conditions for these changes, who are the actors, what is needed, what kind of alliances and solidarities can bring us there. What are researches or also actions that have the contrary effect? So I really think this is really interesting and really hopeful, I think. So you show a bit, there is a relative decline of this Western dominance. People, actors, they opt out. There are counter centers emerging. I think we should study them really in-depthly. And also there are parallel cultural landscape, there are processes of strong and soft reform, and so on. And of course, I think, again, this is very overwhelming. So how can we really do something as scholars and as institutions? And these are issues we discuss quite a lot, it seems to be, also within universities. We're all a bit helpless, but maybe we just could start by studying these examples without doing it ourselves, which brings us also together with other people and makes us and brings up also new alliances, I would say. And yes, I'm not sure if I will reboot the teaching in Neuchâtel, but I have definitely ideas what we can do a bit differently. And third, these ethical dimensions and the ethos and values guiding your work or our work. Thank you very much for raising these issues. I think we often talk about it, but we do not really go into detail into them in a way you did it. And I think your call to decenter this knowledge production at this individual, institutional, infrastructural level amounts really to a powerful and much needed program. I think it's really overwhelming also, but I think it's really important. And maybe just three things. The first thing is I felt quite maybe another angle on this form of decentering I can find in what is called in feminist ethics of care. I always feel like there are elements who are quite complementary to the way you see or you understand decentering. So really like work of Joan Tronto, Maria Puig della Bella Casa, or Parvati Raghuram, who really show how care can serve as a foundation for radical political change, also in view of knowledge production, that we can really, a feminist ethics of care has a potential to, for the universities and knowledge production more broadly, and can push us towards alternative understandings and other practices of knowledge production, namely those grounded not in these ideas of these lonely researchers individually, autonomously being kissed by some ideas, developing his ideas, but really collaboration, participation, renewed definition of excellence, if we even want to stick to this term, actually, which also is, we can, of course, put into question. Or, as Maria Puig de la Casa suggests, I think her ideas of thinking with, writing with, and dissenting with as well, I think that's very important, are important tools to change at the form we produce knowledge, or we teach, or we collect knowledge, etc. But, and this is really a question, at times I think those who can do this are those in stabilized positions. Nowadays in universities, it needs time, it needs funds, and it needs a stabilized position. If you need to make your career, we first need to reboot universities before, actually, I think also people on the way to a stabilized position can do it. Yeah. So many thanks for your careful talk and for these research programs. I think the SUMS has some work to do as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. And Peggy, I would invite you to come back. And I don't know if you want to react, or then we will take a few questions. So
It's just a question.
okay, so let's open the floor for a few questions before we go to the reception to close this day. So who has a question to start with? Yes. Thanks.
So this is a tentative question because a lot of thought emerged from the talk, but I wanted to focus on the vernaculizers, and I want to know what you saw about the risk that this population have to reproduce a kind of a class system where some people can move and can talk about arts coming from where they are from to other people, and the way they frame it might be to, as you said, to bridge two ways of conceiving art and cultural practices. Yeah. And so to which extent the fact that funds come from somewhere and people move all around frames the way dialogue is shaped, and then therefore reproduces what we want to escape. Well, is it really a decentering when it's always the same class that can accept this kind of processes?
Can you all hear me if I'm just talking? Okay. Most times people can't hear me, so that's good. Thank you for that question. And the book is filled with paradoxes and contradiction. And part of the argument is that I think we have to accept contradiction. So most of the people who are leading the charge of decentering belong to this cross-racial, upper middle class to upper middle class, traveling intellectual and cultural class that have more in common with each other than they have with the people in their own countries, who they're in charge of making those institutions more usable and appropriate for everyone in that country, and yet they're out of touch. So, you know, what happens when so many people in Korea have to go abroad to study to get a job back home, and so they come back, and this is true in many countries. So they come back much more versed in this kind of Western way of it's not just the content of what discipline teaches, but the methodology, the argumentation, all that stuff. So you're right that there's a danger in that, and we have to be really aware of that. But at the same time, I'm glad that decentering is happening. And I think that part of the decentering ourselves as individuals means that we have to be aware of that, you know, that I'm part of that. Most of us in this room are part of that. So can we admit that that's happening and somehow we change how we act and formulate the values upon which our work is based and the content of our work in response to that, to try to check it. So I'm not saying that there aren't certain things that I won't draw a line in the sand, but I'm also I think it's counterproductive to look for purity. And I think that a lot of the problems in US politics are because there was a lot of purity policing. And I see, and who could say what about what, and I see what it did. And so I'm done with that. And there was something that Janine said. This is the kind of a day when I forget what's been said. But this is one of the paradoxes. Another paradox is when you form an edgy art scene in your city, lots of people are displaced, right? But it's part of bringing more, bringing a wider range into the contemporary art world, and creating a Soho means that all of the people who are living in that area got displaced, and that we see that gentrification that happens when there is an art scene is another contradiction, right? But now I remember it. So the idea about about we're all at different stages of our career, at our life journey, and we all need to participate in this in different ways. So, I'm nearing the end of my teaching career. I have resources at my disposal. I don't have any more hurdles to climb. So it's incumbent upon me to make opportunities and redistribute the resources I have to other people. And in the Global Decenter, that's part of the ethos, that those of us who can pay, and those of us who can't pay for those who can. And, that I should not be leading to lead. I should be leading to the extent that I should still be leading to help others learn how to be a leader. Or when people ask me to co-author with them so that they learn better how to write themselves. So, but everybody has to do this the way they can do it. People who are just starting out, people who are in precarious positions, people who are under-resourced universities or under-resourced institutions can't, so it's not to say, here's the prescription, you can't do it, don't come at all. It's just be be part of it the way you can. And that will change. I hope I answered. Yvonne,
Thanks a lot, Peggy. It's great to hear about this, the Global Center. I'd love to hear more about it. I'd just like to make a reflection on the role of universities and the historical moment in this whole project. And it's perhaps also that I like to reflect with my colleagues about how grown academically between Latin America. Sorry, company. I have grown academically between Latin America and Switzerland. And when I was going to university in the 1970s, 1980 in Latin America, this was the project. I mean, it was very much that you don't produce knowledge without involving the people that you work with, without giving them a voice of representation, the role of Paulo Freire and the conscientization and all that. So I kind of grew up with that approach, and I came to Switzerland, and especially like 15 years ago, Swiss universities became particularly neoliberal in the sense that it's all about giving international presence to universities, publishing articles in top journals. I mean, this has been the whole issue of ACCR on the move. We have been pushed to publish or perish in top journals about everything, which leaves no effort and no valuation for these kinds of projects. And I say all this because, first of all, there has been a change, so universities can change, but also universities in the West need to change dramatically and sort of make space for that. Even the teaching, when we teach qualitative methods, I mean, we're not questioning a lot of these categories. What is it that, what kind of, how do we collect data? It's all about extractivism. You extract data from your research subjects and it's all for your own career promotion and for the university. So, I mean, we have to start by teaching students by the funding. The funding, when you talk about participatory methods, usually Swiss National Science Foundation is like, what are we going to do with it? So I see the role of Western universities very strongly there. And unfortunately, universities in the global south copied it with more than one. So it is a project for everyone, you know, sort of us researchers, universities as an institution, individuals in the south, in the north. I think we kind of all need to work together on this project. Just want to throw this at you.
no, agreed. You know, this is a hard moment, right? This is a very hard moment, but that's even more why we have to have these conversations. I mean, because I just think that, I believe in prefigurative politics. So that means imagining the world how you want it to be, so you can make it happen. And if we lose the power of imagining a better future, then that means the other side wins. You know, if you can't, like when I ask my students, what would be an ununiversity? What would be an unmuseum? What would be they can't even sort of allow themselves to go, and let me think about that. Like, let me let my whole mind, because they've never been given that permission. And so I think even though it seems like impossible right now, it has to be possible. And you just do this a little bit every day in some way. And yeah, I mean, I think the real question is looking for, there are a lot of people who understand the world. There are religious traditions that understand the world in different ways. We think that we reject that, but think about liberation theology, or think about, you know, the left, relinquish the control of the religious book, or the right took it over, let's put it that way. And so there are lots of places to look, and we just have to go and find out what people are doing and what others doing.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring presentation. I have a very short question. I would like to know, how do you see the role of digitalization within the processes of the polarization and the cultural change? I think you talked about paradoxes before, and digital spaces created alternatives to mainstream cultural pathways.
Yeah.
Digital social movements are an example of alternative ways of actually mobilizing social justice beyond migration or mobility. There are some dynamics that actually are describing in what you qualified as decentering, but in the same time, they're also the opposite. So I'd like to know, how would you actually
What's the opposite for you? Because when you started talking, my mind went somewhere, so tell me what to.
there are also dynamics that reinforce actually
Mhm.
hierarchy, mainstream inequalities, etc. So in this sense,
Yeah.
so how do you see actually the role of digitalization and these digital spaces and dynamics created?
That's a really hard question. I mean, I'm all for any kinds of spaces that bring people together, and certainly digital spaces enable lots of people who haven't been able to participate to be able to be there. I mean, think about the Google Center is built on Zoom. So, but some people, you know, halfway, that most of the time their internet is faulty, so they're there, but we can't hear them, or they freeze or whatever. So there's inequality and unequal access to that. I want to answer your question with an anecdote, which just really got me thinking, which was, I was in Nepal before I came here, and there was a man, a discussion I was part of, who's part of the National Archive. And they've been digitizing all of their materials and images. And now Getty and some of those big companies that own images that you have to pay for own the images, so that Nepali citizens have to pay for those images, and it's really expensive for them. And I just hadn't thought about that intermediary of the company gaining, a profit-making company controlling access to these images that are sacred to people, or also so that's an example of lots of people can get access to archives now. They want them to be available, but this man from the National Archives was like heartbroken, saying, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing because of that unintended or unexpected perverse consequence. I don't know the answer to it. But it really made me think. It really made me think. Do you have any ideas about how to make digital spaces less hierarchical?
Actually, we can have examples from migration studies for with digital data, for instance, to draw the example. But in the same time, I think that there is something happening where looking digitally from digital social movements. I think we see some other kind of mechanisms which people are actually gathering and mobilizing for more social justice goals. And this for me is a mechanism for decentering because people are
decentering. Yeah. Yes.
coming together first order was yes.
Yeah. Yeah, but we were talking this morning, in the session with the students about, you know, that there's no center, there's no center that you can, where you can fight back. And it's also so insidious because all of these players online who don't know where they are and how to, you don't know how to reach them to talk to them. And so if you're mounting a political, you want to make a political point, it's not just 3 TV networks anymore, it's, you know, 3,000. And so I think that's the question of the moment, like, how do you actually fight fake news? Or fake news as a catch-all category for all kinds of stuff that's out there that people don't even think question whether what they're hearing is, if it comes from, they believe in the politics of the vehicle.
We just take the last question before we close the.
Thank you for the inspiring talk and the comment. I have a question regarding the dual consciousness you were talking about, because I'm not quite sure if I understood it. I guess you may refer to the voice. I don't know, but you were saying that the aspirate being at times can carry a double consciousness or a dual consciousness that has a lot of that is powerful, right? And I was thinking, do you also think that in the process of decentering or unlearning, a double consciousness or dual consciousness might be cultivated by people that are privileged or that don't have experiences of migration? So to say that consciousness can be migranticized, so to say, or, you know, I'm trying to, and if so, how do we do that as scholars, you know? I mean, how do we in our everyday work,
Yeah.
try to maybe migranticize our consciousness? I mean, this word.
What would that mean exactly in practice? What would that mean?
Yeah, because he was saying that the diasporic being is already a dual consciousness, and that is powerful, right? So how can we then maybe, I mean, then would you then argue that this way of understanding the world is only reserved to people that have these experiences of migration, or can it also be learned and shared and incorporated by those and really truly understood by those that don't have this kind of experiences in order to really change, I don't know, research, society, etc.?
I thought about this idea a lot about are these people having this dual, what I want to call it dual consciousness. And I wasn't thinking about that with the point I was making about the vernacularists. It's just that it's a powerful social glue, the experience that they've shared. So it's a part of the tool of disrupting the inequality python, because they understand each other and so they connect, and also they understand where they live and where the work is trying to travel to, and they can translate, they can vernacularize that to the potential users. That was the point I was trying to make. So, but you're asking whether somebody who has not migrated could have that sensibility of another place and be able to be that kind of bridge. I think it's a lot harder because part of it is you've lived there and you know how to, you know, all those things that you learn from, you know, just daily life. And so it's the difference between visiting as a tourist and even staying for 3 months. It's a different relationship. You start to understand the nuances of a place. So, but that's not what I was talking about in terms of the usefulness for the inequality pipeline, because it's anybody who, when I talked about that Peggy Young and her connection to Bina Chow and Dorian Chung, it's partly about that they each know the places where they're living, but it's also that they share Koreanness and they share not only Korean culture, but that they share the same intellectual pot that Korean Americans don't share. So there's limits to it. A Korean American and a Korean can share some of that, but what Hae Young was saying was there are limits to that, which is interesting too.
Thank you. So this will be, I think, the final word. We can continue the discussion downstairs on the ground floor. We have a reception. You are all welcome to come, of course, and we can give a round of applause again to Peggy for this very inspiring talk. And thank you all for coming today for this inspiring day. Thank you very much.